We're going to have a panel discussion now on agreeing on standards and the standards to come. We've been talking a lot about data spaces. It's very timely. We know this morning the Commission unveiled its public procurement data space plan. And we're delighted to have us moderating this section, Jeff Vlegels, who works at the Secretariat-General of the European Commission in the unit responsible for coordinating corporate governance on data, information and knowledge management. Jeff, thank you very much for joining us. I know you've got a great panel of experts to talk with, 4 leading experts, some of whom we have seen doing other presentations over the last 3 days of Endorse. I also want to remind the audience that you will have an opportunity to ask questions at the end, but do put those questions in on Slido by scanning the QR code on the screen or going to slido.com and putting in Endorse 2023 so that we can get those collated and ready and get as many of your responses as possible from our experts. But Jeff, I'm going to hand over the floor to you now to tell us a bit about what you expect from the discussion and to introduce your panelists.
Thank you very much. I can only agree that we have a great panel here, and I hope we can have a very interesting discussion. So the title of this is a bit of a special panel in the conference, I think. We are going to discuss how we negotiate and advocate on new standards and standards to come. So this is a non-technical panel. We will not talk about technical standards. We are really focusing on how to reach a common understanding. And we're going to put specific attention on how to reach a common agreement when you have a very diverse playing field. So meaning we have all kinds of different organizations, sectors, people that should feel themselves represented in standards. So how do we deal with that? How do we find a way forward? How do we find a common understanding in this situation? How do we deal sometimes with political pressures or sensitivities? And what are methods or maybe governance procedures we can use and that have been successful in the past to overcome these challenges and obstacles? So before we really move into the panel discussion, all the members of the panel will give a short presentation, 5 to 10 minutes, to introduce themselves and their backgrounds. So I propose without further ado, I give the floor to the first panelist, which is Stephen Abbott Pugh, who is head of technology in the Open Ownership organization, the Beneficial Ownership Transparency organization, and I'm sure he will be able to introduce himself a bit in more detail.
Stephen, I think you're on mute.
Apologies.
No
Apologies,
problem.
rookie mistake. I just want to say thank you, Jeff, and thanks everyone for having me here today. Apologies for my organisation, Open Ownership, has been running for about 6 years and focusing on beneficial ownership transparency, working with over 40 governments all over the world. And so I'm really pleased to be here with you today to talk about the political side of trying to get people to implement data standards, in our case, the beneficial ownership data standard that I help to look after. Now, the reason why I think it's important to have this discussion, obviously every single context in which we work and every country with which we work have different issues at play when it comes to beneficial ownership or who really owns companies. But the real value that can be realised from this data is from connecting it across different jurisdictions and all across the world. Because as we know and as we've seen multiple times, there are large issues which beneficial ownership data can help to identify and help to track if it's available and if it can be linked across different jurisdictions. Now, what I want to focus on today is to talk about why I think this is very, very relevant with discussions that are ongoing in the European Union at the moment, and to talk a little bit about some of the legal areas, but I'll be very, very quick. So hopefully people will know that the space around beneficial ownership transparency is changing quite fast in the EU context. There was a ruling from the Court of Justice of the European Union in November 2022, which ruled that public access to beneficial ownership registers impinges on the privacy rights of people across the EU member states. But simultaneously, or very shortly before that, a report from the European Commission came out saying that data from your EU member states registers need to be better connected, needs to be interoperable in terms of being able to find the kind of ownership structures and the owners in particular that are either potentially sanctioned or should not be able to access certain markets in the European Union. And alongside this debate and the kind of anti-money laundering side of things, you obviously have the Public Sector Information Directive and now the Open Data Directive that is asking for more and more company registration information to be opened up. And you have other efforts which show that more and more company information is a very valuable thing for businesses and for the markets across Europe. The original impact assessment for the PSI directive, which was conducted in 2020, found that beneficial ownership data would have huge social, political, and business value were it to be unveiled. Unfortunately, because of this changing political and legal situation, that was not in the final Open Data Directive. So you have company registration information, but not beneficial ownership data on who really owns those companies. And I think there'll be more and more discussion and need for that beneficial ownership data moving forward. So it's a very key time to think about that, because I fear that the legal side might hold back efforts to connect between different registers across the block. I hope it doesn't, but there's a danger that does. What my organisation tries to do about that is we offer an open standard called the Beneficial Ownership Data Standard that has already been endorsed by the UK's Open Standards Board and is in use by 3 governments around the world who publish directly to the standard, and also is being used by a couple of registry software companies who realise that being able to help their clients connect data from their business registries and beneficial ownership registries is going to be a really key area for them in the future. And again, this standard is open for anyone to use. We have data from the UK, Denmark, Slovakia, Latvia, in Europe that's already mapped to the standard and is connected to show the value of being able to follow those beneficial ownership chains where they go. Just really quickly, I wanted to say that some countries in Europe have also committed to publishing this data. So Portugal and Lithuania have committed to using BODs, and other countries that are in the process of adapting the standard. So it's beneficial ownership transparency becomes very political. I focus on some of the technical side of it, but I'm very happy to be here today in the discussion to talk about how we maybe balance the political and legal side and the privacy side with more of the technical side. So thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Stephen. Very clear. And from Stephen, we can go to our next speaker, Mr. Gernot Friedrich, who is representing NATO here. He works at the NATO headquarters as a part of the digital staff, working on harmonization of data standards and in general on becoming a more data-driven organization. Mr. Friedrich, if you're ready.
Yes, I am. Thank you, Jeff, for... Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Jeff, for having me and inviting me to a EU conference from a NATO perspective. Now, we are, of course, also a multinational organization having very much similar members than the EU has. But, of course, our business field is slightly different. And therefore, our standardization approach, we are our own standardization organization, has its own challenges. As you mentioned, I'm working in the digital staff, or the NATO headquarters C3 staff, but it's an acronym nobody can pronounce, in the digital staff of NATO. And next slide here, let's see if we can move forward. Yeah, and basically we got the task last year by the heads of states and government during the Madrid summit to basically start an alliance-wide digital transformation. So when we talk about alliance, we mean all the allies, all our 30, hopefully soon 30 plus 2 allies, and also the NATO enterprise. The NATO enterprise those entities that are multinational, so similar to, let's say, EU Commission or EU institutions. So that's our scope that we have ahead of us, and we are currently working very diligently on that. Now, one of the drivers in the digital transformation for us in the standardization side is the ambition to have a data-driven organization. So data-driven consultation, which is the political consultation, but also data-driven decision-making and decision support in the area of military command and control. So for that, what you can see is we have an entire stack that we have to modernize and digitize. We have our traditional CIS enablers, and at that area, we have to introduce an interoperable data-centric architecture that allows us to share in many areas near real-time quality data, to then use our data analytics to exploit data either with artificial intelligence or traditional human intelligence analysts, this data to come to data-driven decision-making. Now, if you look at the speed that we have to do this in, so have in the military domain, different areas like cyber, space, air, land, and maritime. So I think cyberspace is very common to all of us. Decisions have to be made there in near real time to be able to respond to potential cyber threats. So that automation and making data automatically processable, what we heard in the previous session, is a key driver for us that we have to do. Now, unfortunately, over the last 10, 15, 20 years, all our data standards were more or less driven by those domains. So we have perfect silos of data standards that have been developed with different semantics, different formats in all those domains. If you want to go to data exploitation and automatic fusion and correlation of data, we need to be able to have interoperable data. And this is all, as we heard earlier, about the semantics. And that's our key challenge that we are driving there. And then if you look at that, these are just the 5 domains, but then we have 5 domains per 30 allies. So that shows you the complexity of our area of standardization that we have to resolve. So what we see right now, I gave you a screenshot here, is that we are combining already things like artificial intelligence with live data, and then we have to categorize data and put them into our standards to share them to come to what we call a common operating picture. And these standards, as you can see on the right side, are adding value already to the situation that we have right now in Ukraine. So how do we do that? Our digital area, and I think there we are slightly different from the EU side. We have all our allies at the table and also the operational users at the table when it comes to requirements. So we have a very strong requirements organization. We then have a capability planning mechanism, defense planning that EU has in a very similar area, where we can influence the interoperability standards that the nations will use on a voluntary basis. And then what we also have is with our exercise and evaluation programs, we have the ability to validate that those interoperability standards have been implemented, or to what degree they have been implemented by our nations. So our staff is responsible to support the Consultation Command and Control Board, which is one of the key tasking authorities for standards in NATO. And we are setting the governance and compliance mechanisms that we work with the nations. But that is all with the nations on a voluntary basis. So now going into data standards. So it's not all military standards. We have adopted more than 2,000 industry and open standards, and that's the preferred way of working. But for some specific use cases, we also have roughly 150 active NATO C3 standards that we are responsible for in the staff, and there are some other areas that are working there as well. We use an open architecture approach, so we have a taxonomy. You can see on the right side, which is interesting enough, managed by a semantic media wiki, so a collaborative effort in that area. And then we have another area I come later on in our discussion, which helps us implementing standards and bundling standards, which is the Federated Mission Networking Initiative. Now, the key element to start with is all about metadata. So we have three specific specifications that are cross-cutting for all our information. And the reason why that's important is security plays a very critical role for us. And we need security metadata for all our information and data products that we have. They need to be recognized universally across the board. But then we have national security policies, and we have to have those metadata that actually can also work with national policies. So that's quite a challenge, and these are three foundational standards. And just 2 days ago, the US at their MOD level have basically adopted 5636, the core metadata specification, in their national federal guidelines, and have basically taken a subset of that for the US federal national use as well. And then last but not least, to harmonize our more than 40 different data standards that the different organizations have developed over time, we have or currently developing a core data framework. And one of the key elements of that is that we use ontologies or semantic reference models for all our different areas, and then try to map the common elements into a core model that we can use for our data standards development. So we're not harmonizing the data, we're harmonizing the data standards upfront, so that the nations, when they implement them, are trying to become as harmonized as possible. With that, thank you. Back to you, Jeff.
Thank you very much, Gernot, to give us a peek in your a sneak peek in your very interesting and complex organization. Let's talk a bit more about it in the discussion. Our next speaker is Makx Dekkers, who is what you could call independent information professional. He is an independent, let's say, consultant, and he has a very long experience in the field since the 80s. So more than 30 years, he's been working on standards. I understood because I wasn't there yet, but he was working on standards. So he's here to give us the historical perspective a bit, I think, and also because he has experience with shaping new standards, a lot of different new standards, and he's been working with a lot of different organizations, among which the European Commission via the Publication Office. So, Makx, the floor is to you.
We have you on mute, or you have yourself on mute, because we can see you and we can see your slides, but we can't hear you.
Okay.
Okay, great.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, thanks, Makx.
Okay. So thank you, Jeff, for introducing me, and thank you for having me here. Yes, as you said, Jeff, I'm independent. I have been involved with standardization for about 35 years now. So I'm not talking about a particular activity or a single organization, but Jeff asked me to tell you a little bit about my experiences and my views on standardization as an activity. So you can see I was involved in ISO from 1987. I was involved with the Dublin Core Metadata Initiative, then also with the European Standard Organization, CEN ISSS, as it was called at the time, on cultural diversity and e-government. I am an expert, invited expert at W3C for various working groups, also for DCAT, something that also Pierre-Antoine talked about earlier. And currently I'm still involved with the ISA Interoperable Europe activity to try to get consensus across member states for the publication of data sets and open data. So that's sort of my background and my experience there. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what my views and my experience is in the area of standardization. I think it's very important when we talk about standardization to identify sort of the goal of it. And the goal is that we need to interoperate. So we need in systems to be able to exchange data. But in my mind, also a very important part of interoperability is interoperability between people. So understanding between people, and that is usually the most complex part of standardization. So interesting in standardization is that we're trying to create agreements above and beyond the interest of individual stakeholders. So, and hoping that what we do with consensus, the sum is going to be more than the parts. So there's something that everybody can gain from that. On one hand, from companies and organizations that participate in standardization, we hope to create or a level playing field for systems and for software. And from the point of view of the users, it would open up sort of the field so that people can choose which products they use while having data as a standard. So that is something that you can find best products and also reduce the risk of vendor lock-in. And that is from a user perspective important, of course. There are a couple of challenges that I've seen and things that we need to work on if we want to have standards development be successful. It's clear for people who participate in standards that using a standard reduces autonomy, because you really have to do things in a common way, so you can't actually do things very specific to your product or to your service. That is something that people need to realize, and it takes time. I always say if you have a problem, you put a couple of smart people in a room, they'll probably solve the problem in a couple of days. In standards, you're talking about a couple of months and maybe even a couple of years. So this is something that you need to take into account. To mitigate those risks and respond to those challenges, I think it's important that there is trust among the stakeholders. So if you go into a standards organization, standards activity, you need to be able to trust the people who sit there, that people are interested in creating that consensus and not there to sell their own product, for example. There is always a case where you have different sizes of companies and different, let's say, weight of companies. So finding consensus and compromise there could be a challenge, but that is something that you need to take into account. There's also always in standards organizations and standards activities vocal and silent participation, which is something that you need to sort of balance between, so that people that are usually silent also get a chance to give their opinion. And one important part is there is a need to create awareness among providers and users to explain the benefits and the challenges of standards development. So from my perspective, I think there's a couple of things that we can do to mitigate those risks and respond to those challenges. Is transparency, I think, is very important. Having open discussion platforms, for example, currently we use a lot of GitHub, where people can put issues and you can see discussions, and also establish clear processes and procedures, but also try to keep that lightweight, because we don't want to discuss all the process and procedures rather than the content of the work that we're doing. Be inclusive, so attention to gender and culture, and especially because there might be people in cultures where people talk a lot about what they're going to do, whereas other cultures, people only want to talk about what they have done. And that is something also, a balance that needs to be found. Making sure that the right persons, the right people and organizations are involved in the process is important. It's not always easy, but certainly if people cannot participate actively, make sure that the review process of a standard is advertised widely so that people can participate in public reviews. Building corporate atmospheres to reach consensus, I think, is important, keeping in mind that those differences in ways of working and difference in the way that different cultures might address those issues, especially also in the case of these silent participants, make sure that when people make comments, they're all taken into account and seriously, so that people feel welcome to express their opinion. And also at the end, I think it's really important to publish the standards that are being developed in an open and free to use way. So that is something that I think some of the things that I found in the years that I was involved in standardization. Thank you.
Thank you, Makx. Very clear. Okay, then we are ready for our final panelist, the last panelist, last but not least. He was also keynote speaker earlier today, Pierre-Antoine Champin. He's a data strategist, I understood as a title, working with RDFs and semantic web technologies for, and I quote, as long as he can remember. And he is affiliated to the World Wide Web Consortium, which I'm pretty confident many of us are familiar with as an international standards organization. Pierre, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jeff. So my presentation is entitled The Art of Consensus at W3C. This title may look strange. Actually, I borrowed it from a set of web pages also called The Guide that we have at W3C, which is a sum of collective intelligence gathered for the benefit of our members and especially of group chairs. So I like this title because it shows the importance of consensus that Mark has already emphasized. That's core to the way we build standards at W3C. So W3C means indeed World Wide Web Consortium. It's the organization that has been created to standardize the technologies underlying the web as we know it, and its motto is leading the web to its full potential. This is a consortium of organizations. At the moment, we have a little more than 460 member organizations that are very diverse and heterogeneous, ranging from private companies to public organizations like universities, research centers, government agencies, and so on. And also very diverse in size, from multinationals, like all the big players of the web that you can imagine, to small startups and non-profit organizations. The W3C is built on a vision for the web and defines a number of values in the standards that it builds and promotes. That vision can be summarized as make the web work for everyone. Making it work means that implementations and concrete realizations of standards are very important for W3C. As a matter of fact, there's a general rule that no specification gets published as a W3C standard, as a W3C recommendation, until it gets 2 independent implementations. The goal is twofold. First, to prove the technical feasibility of the standard, but also to prove that there is interest enough in the community to spend some time in implementing them. So we don't want to publish standards that are just abstract and pure on paper or on document standards, but that are actually being used in the wild. And making it work for everyone is also really important. W3C has a number of experts in domains such as accessibility, internationalization, security, privacy, and our process dictates that whenever a charter is published that will define what a working group must work on, and whenever a recommendation is published, so a standard specification, those experts are to review the given charter or the given recommendation before it is actually published, in order to ensure that all those values that Makx already alluded to are respected and enforced in the work to come, or the work that has been done. W3C has a strong culture of openness and transparency. Again, well, it's no wonder that Makx and I have such an overlap in our presentation, given Max's activity at W3C. But so W3C working groups have their discussion on public channels, historically public mailing lists, and more public GitHub repositories, where everyone is free to look at what's going on in the group. Not only that, but also chime in and give some feedback to the group, even if you're not a member of the group, but you have ideas or feedback to make on the work of the group. This is welcome on those channels, and this is taken into account in order to make the best possible standards. All the specifications published by W3C are available on the web, obviously, free of charge. But also an important point is that they are subject to a strict patent policy, meaning that W3C members, big or small, make a commitment that they will not claim royalties for any patents that they would have on the technologies that are part of W3C standards. So they are free to read and free to implement, and free as in free speech as well as in free beer. Finally, W3C doesn't work in isolation. Of course, there are a number of other standard organizations or stakeholders in the standards that we have built. Some of them are represented here in this panel. W3C has a number of liaisons, more or less formally defined, with all these organizations that are listed on this web page. And as a matter of fact, some of our specifications are published jointly by W3C and some of these organizations. For example, the current Spatial Data on the Web working group is a joint effort with the Open Geospatial Consortium, and all the recommendations are published with under the two organizations. So to sum it up, W3C is really a community-driven organization, and if you're interested in knowing more, those are my contacts. And thank you. Over to you, Jeff.
Thank you very much, Pierre. And thank you to all the panelists for this introduction and for introducing yourself and your affiliation, let's say. I think it shows that we have tried with this panel to have a diverse representation of different types of organizations with very different contexts and different positions, restrictions, and goals, and so on. And I will try to, in the discussion, also make this apparent, and this will show different approaches, I think. And let me directly move to the first question. Mr. Friedrich, Gernot, if you don't mind, I'm interested, I mean, like you say, the NATO is a standardization body, can be considered a standardization body, where you have countries represented, or allies represented, might be the best word for it. But at the same time, you are negotiating and deciding on standards that have maybe a much far-reaching consequences, not only for those allies only. How do you ensure that everyone who might be influenced or might be subject to the standardizations you decide on, how everyone is represented and feels themselves represented in the process?
That's a very interesting question. And our process basically, let's start at the top, requests us to have the 30 allies to approve our standards. So therefore, we can have a wider participation in the development of the standard, but the approval is always by 30 allies, hopefully soon 32 allies. So that's the very first one, that the governance is pretty strict and top down. So therefore, if we have standards that are of security concern and might be classified, so at that point, we have to have also formal approval to get those countries that are not NATO allies invited into the process. And again, very formal at that one. But most of our standards are not classified. And therefore, when we are at that area, we aim for adopting, number one, open standards or industry standards. And you have seen that earlier in my presentation. We have more than 2,000 IT standards that we basically bring in for our use. We're profiling them. And then we have a very limited number of our own data and IT standards that we have there. Now, if our interest, like I mentioned earlier, these metadata specifications, they are not only in our interest, we consider security also in the interest of, let's say, banks, pharmaceuticals, and other areas. So therefore, those standards have been developed right from the beginning as publicly available and publicly releasable products. And we are aiming, the custodian of those standards is aiming to find a NATO, not a NATO, an international standards body that has the even wider audience that we can bring in to hand over those standards at a certain maturity level to those bodies. So this is the collaboration that we have because our internal standardization is highly regulated and governed.
Okay, yes, that's clear. Yeah, we understand that this is very top down for some of these internal standards. Indeed, I wonder what's the view of Pierre on this. How do you ensure that when you discuss a specific standard, all the relevant stakeholders are present at the table?
So that's indeed a a tricky question. When we create a working group, we try very hard to have all the stakeholders around the table. I well, I mentioned it during my panel before. I mentioned the community groups, which are another important part of W3C. Community groups are much more open. They do not require formal membership in W3C to participate, and they are very often used as a place for incubation of future standards. So one way to get stakeholders on board is to have this incubation happen in community groups in a very open setup. So that anybody can feel free to come and join. There's no strong commitment in doing that. And then when the work of the community group is moved over to a recommendation track and it becomes the prerogative of the working group, then hopefully the community is aware of what's happening and has the opportunity to become a member and join formally the working group, or to if for some reasons they can't or they don't want to do that, to participate as an external participant, because as I mentioned, we are very much open to feedback from the community at large and not just W3C official members.
Okay, thank you. And now, from a different perspective, the same issue, but from a different perspective, Stephen, I think from your point of view, from the open ownership standard, maybe at some point you have noted that a specific forum is discussing and you are not yet involved. Has this occurred to you, and how are you approaching this issue? How are you making sure that you're involved in all the necessary fora that are relevant for your advocacy, let's say?
Sure. So I think the challenge that we have in our space is that we are trying to help turn international kind of political or policy standards into something that people can capture in data. We do have, I'm very glad to hear what Makx and Pierre-Antoine were talking about in terms of having an open standard using GitHub. We do some of those pieces of work. We do not have as many kind of formal levels of engagement as we would hope, and we're building that engagement as we go. But we try to translate things like the Financial Action Task Force and Recommendation 24 and 25 on beneficial ownership of companies and trusts, taking it from a kind of political or policy standard and looking at what data you would need to capture in line with that. We also work with organizations like the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, so other organizations that are pushing forward their policy standards that governments have signed up to and offering a way for that data to be captured. We do also have some structures where we have a leadership group of countries that like to think of themselves as being in the vanguard of this. So They sign up again to a political set of agreements of how they will publish their data, and we work with them. And we also do work with some implementing organizations. But yes, we have less engagement on the technical side, and we have more shifting international norms and political standards that we are trying to adjust to keep up with.
And a short follow-up question on this, Stephen. I mean, I'm sure, like any one of us, you have a limit in your resources. Yeah? So at a certain point, you will have to prioritize between which activities you get get involved in and which not. How would you prioritize between different ongoing, let's say, negotiations or panels and so on?
Yeah, it's we offer all of the features and things that we are going to develop on a long-term basis. So you can see all the work we're planning for our next year and a half already published on GitHub. We seek to get feedback and kind of information from implementers and everyone as we go. But the challenge of the governance of that and who makes the ultimate decisions is still open. It is at the moment, it's my organization, or it's more of like technically driven rather than politically driven in terms of those decisions. But we are looking to put in place more governance mechanisms. So really interesting to hear about some of this. And I know that members of our team who helped develop our standard also work in some of the W3C groups. So they are bringing some of those same methods of working into what we're doing.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So, Makx, if you don't mind, we have a very similar question, but now instead of identifying all the relevant stakeholders, really with a focus on diversity and inclusiveness. From all the relevant stakeholders, when discussing a standard, you have a lot of different stakeholders. Not all of the stakeholders have, let's say, the same capacity. Yeah? Some of them are very limited in their resources to be able to be represented at the negotiation table. How do you ensure all of the relevant, how do you ensure the diversity of partners is represented, even the ones that have very limited resources?
Well, yeah, of course, that's a challenge. And I said so before, to have that diversity is something that you can only try to achieve. One of the things that I always find important in these activities is that you communicate. Getting the message out to people that something's happening. Sometimes it's easy. For example, if there is a legal requirement to do something, then people will want to be involved. If you have an organization like NATO, who is sort of very hierarchical, then you actually have some means to tell people to come to an activity. So, but if you're in a more open environment, you're basically dependent on what people can provide. It's always important to have that in mind. Of course, you cannot force people to come, and you cannot force people from different cultures to be involved. But when you have an activity, be aware that those issues might be relevant in an activity. And it's not always easy to do that, but I think if you have a situation where you see that there is insufficient participation from areas in the world or from gender balance, then try to communicate and make sure that people are aware of the needs to be inclusive and that people are aware that those activities take place, and also provide them with some arguments of the benefits of being involved. But in the end, it is up to people themselves, to organizations themselves, to come in and provide input and make sure that they're heard. So you can do only so much, but be aware that those issues are always important.
So thank you, Makx. And it's on the final aspect that I want to elaborate a bit more, let's say, because what are suppose you're struggling to engage specific stakeholders, what are the main arguments that can be used to convince them? Because in a lot of cases, the standards are beneficial for them. On the other hand, standards, like you also mentioned, Max, they create additional work and less freedom and so on. So what arguments are really working for you?
You're asking me?
Yes, if you want.
Yeah, no, what are the arguments? The arguments are basically in the effect of having a standard. And I think there are cases where people are not interested in having a standard. People might want to do things on their own. You're not going to capture them. But a lot of people are interested in sharing this because even if you have limited resources, if you pull these resources in a standards activity, you're actually learning something from others as well. So it's not just that you're out on your own, you're doing things, but you also have sort of the feedback and the cross-fertilization of the activities. And in the end, you will have better products, I think. You can actually advertise, and people do that all the time. People have these W3C logos on their standards, and people are trying to use that as sort of a marketing tool as well. And I think that is the case that you have to be able to explain that. And one thing that I think I also wanted to come back a little bit to who is involved, because it's not in some cases, I said in NATO you have someone who has a hierarchy and can do things that people have to attend to. But if you have not, I think you need to go for shared ownership. You need to go for having all the participants in a working group contributing to the awareness raising. So indeed, people, there's no single answer for the benefits of standards organization, standards development, but the participants are the best people to actually explain to others what the benefits are.
Okay, so shared responsibilities. And I wonder maybe, Pierre, if you can, do you have anything to add here? Or are you using in W3C other arguments to really convince people to get involved?
Don't have much to add to this, I'm afraid, especially since I've not been in the team and therefore involved in member recruitment and so on for a very long time. My experience is that nowadays W3C is pretty well known. The people who are interested by the standards know about W3C, and I think most of them understand the value of this organization, and as Makx said, the value of cross-fertilization and making contact with other stakeholders. Unfortunately, I don't have much, but I see Gernot wanted to also had something to say.
Yeah, thanks for that, Pierre-Antoine. I think I have to clarify something, that NATO is not a dictatorship, that everything comes from top. It's our approval process that is at 30, and it is a consensus-based approval. So basically, we always have to get all our allies to agree on a standard. But that doesn't mean that all 30 allies are involved in developing a standard. So therefore, we are in a very similar situation as you all are in standards organizations and standards development processes. We're depending on the volunteers that are coming to develop the standard. Now, the critical thing for that is, and I think you mentioned that, Max, is the benefits. You have to really identify the benefits, why you would spend resources on this. And this is where we are probably in a better situation than others, as we have as I mentioned earlier, our requirements process, where we are linking the, let's say, technical standards development to the procedural standards development. NATO is all about the allies. The allies have to work together. And I liked your sentence, Max, that you said it's not just the technical interoperability, it's really the ability to operate together. And this is what is at the DNA of NATO. We have to be able to operate together. So therefore, we have actually two levels of standardization. One is the procedural and terminology standardization, so that we understand each other and know how to work together. And then out of that comes the need to share information. So with that needing to share information, that drives then all the technical standards development. And therefore, with that kind of traceability of the technical standards work all the way back to what do we want to achieve with that in terms of working together, that is allowing us to basically communicate the benefit. And therefore, you can get nations to contribute on a voluntary basis. And then, of course, we have the challenge that we have more than 30 participants quite often from the different countries, and they have different cultures, they have different backgrounds, they have different industry interests, and we have to balance that as well. So therefore, I think our internal standards development processes are very, very similar to yours. It's simply the approval at the end is consensus-based, but that ensures that all of our key stakeholders, the nations, are involved. And there's a veto right, so basically we have to get all 30 on board to get the standards approved, but that doesn't mean they all implement that standard. There's no directive to implement these standards in a nation. So that's a voluntary process again. So nations, once they have approved a standard, have a secondary one where they ratify the implementation, and they then say, and we are now committing ourselves to implement a standard. That's two steps. So approving it and then saying, and I'm now going to implement it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for coming in, and that's very interesting. So we have, I think, a consensus on consensus. And let's elaborate a bit more, Gernot, because one of the things you touch upon is the fact that you're dealing with a lot of different international. You're in a very international setting with many different cultural, let's say, capitals. The cultural capital differs, but also a lot of different political priorities, let's say, and sometimes very much conflicting, and then also sectorial and economic importance in specific countries to defend specific standards, I guess. How do you, so it's also in our experience for some of the topics we discuss, some of the discussions become very political, where certain countries are really can really be pushing forward or completely blocking it. How do you deal with that? And how do you ensure that this is not, let's say, completely blocking one standard or even all other ongoing negotiations? Because of the political sensitivity, sometimes you have these spillover effects, in my experience.
That's a very challenging question, because that reflects my daily life, that we have to have that political consensus. There's a lot of negotiations, one-on-one negotiations that we have to do on that to find the compromise. But for that one, we have to identify, as the staff that supports the nations, what are the motivations behind that. And then it's at the end a trade-off where you have to look at if we are not moving forward with a standard, what are the impacts? And this is where, again, it helps if we can make that linkage back to what are we not being able to achieve, what are we not able to work together if we have a blockage somewhere that we can't resolve. And that can be taking quite some time, but at the end of the day, as I said, the DNA of NATO is that all allies can work together. And therefore, in those areas where they work, so we have, let's say, take some nations that are landlocked, of course, they have no navy, so navy standards for them are not relevant. So you have to understand all those interests as well. But for those things that then they work together, you can then negotiate and identify what the political issues result in terms of operational disadvantage that you have. So you can't work together in logistics, for example, or you can't share your transport, as an example. And that is, of course, if you are now looking at the current situation, is something where it's very much in our interest that we can share that, and then some of those then basically resolve the blockages that we have. The other mechanism we have built up is, I mentioned slightly earlier, this FMN initiative. So that is also initiated by NATO. But in that one, we have more open to partners. So we have a lot of non-NATO allies involved in there as well, and other organizations are observing us, like the EU is an observer in that area, EU military staff. So this is where we can open things up a little bit more, and we have a less regulated discussion area, and you could have those impacts that I was talking about really discussed at the staff level, and therefore the staffs could then communicate at the political level what these potential issues are they are causing by the political problems they have. And it's not easy. We have many different interests in certain areas, but that is the challenge to overcome.
Okay, thank you. That's very interesting again. There are two things I wanna elaborate here, and the first one is the importance of an informal, let's say, shadow diplomacy besides the formal field. But the second thing, and maybe let's first focus on that, and maybe I will ask the questions to Stephen because he is also, I think, very knowledgeable on this. Because Stephen, I think in your occasion, I think you might have also some experiences that when you are, let's say, advocating for an open ownership standard, that this is completely not in the interest of some of the involved international partners there. So on the contrary, how do you deal with this? What's your approach? Do you have formal or informal procedures there in place?
So I think we come up against some of the challenges that other participants have identified, in terms of there are countries that just aren't as interested in standardizing the data, or they don't realize the value of standards. I think a lot of the time at the moment, to be honest, we explain that the problems that they're seeing locally can be solved by having data or collecting data that can be more easily linked to other data sets from other countries. Almost every country we work with has another jurisdiction that they think is involved in a way. So if you speak, maybe it's Singapore, maybe it's Mauritius, but parties are often very interested in finding out what data from other countries can show them. And so that's a really helpful way for us to talk about standards, because in isolation, a lot of the countries might not have realized how to approach standardizing their data, or how they could best collect it, so they could try to connect it with other jurisdictions. So yeah, certainly we have challenges around convincing people of the technical usefulness basis there, but they're often coming to us realizing that everyone from the UN, the World Bank, the EU, Financial Action Task Force have all written reports saying that more data is needed in this area. More connecting more of the information will help to get to the bottom of some of the problems that are being identified, and some of the kind of opaque structures that people are putting in place. And that almost without a global solution, you'll still always have countries that are havens, or where people are kind of hiding activity. So we do have a lot of challenges. In some places, we've come up against issues where legacy systems are often a really challenging thing for us to overcome. We're trying to convince people who don't have a huge amount of funding to invest upfront in collecting better quality data to realize values further down the line. And we often come up against challenges where those organizations just don't have the funding. They're There's liable to be political change, which shifts their responsibilities. But that's definitely a big area for us. Yeah.
All right, thank you. I'll pick up on a few of your things, specifically funding, later in the panel. But maybe, Makx, can you share with your experience negotiating on different standards over the years? How what's your estimation of how important or informal networks, let's say, among the stakeholders? And yeah.
One thing is I really want also to stress that standardization is not something you do in isolation. Standardization not something that someone in a room thinks, oh, let's standardize this or that. Usually standards are driven by needs. There might be driven by needs in terms of legal requirements, which happens, for example, in the European Union with directives, and people need to actually build systems in response to those directives. So people are doing that in a certain context. There are also informal cases where 2 or 3 organizations think it would benefit them to exchange data, and therefore they try to, rather than trying bilateral exchanges, think it would be good to bring together a group of people to do that. So it's not always a case of selling the idea of a standard. It's basically responding to a need. And I think that's important. So in that sense, the negotiation is sort of outside or before you start building standards, because people actually want to have a standard to do things. I have also been involved in the past in standards activities that were driven by standards people. Well, they're always disappear. That doesn't work, because then you have to sell something to people that they actually haven't thought about. Now, I think most of the negotiations, if you can say that, take place on the political level. In the European Commission, like between member states in NATO, between members at W3C, people decide at some point that it would be useful to do this standardization. So it makes it a little bit easier. You don't have to do, from my point of view, in a standards organization, the negotiation. You actually have to have, and maybe that's something that in my experience was always important. There is something beyond the standards activity. There is either a political level, or there is a consortium level that drives the need for standardization. And I think it's important, because otherwise you need to actually sell the idea of a standard. Now, what you also want to have, if you start small with a couple of countries or a couple of members that want to do something, that you try to achieve a snowballing effect. So you need to show people what the benefits are. So you have to communicate about what you're doing. You have to communicate about the benefits. So rather than having a negotiation, it's sort of an awareness raising and a promotion activity that you're doing in standards. Because I don't believe that if you need to negotiate a standard, that you're going to have people who really want to cooperate. And so I would frame it more in promotion than in negotiation.
Okay, thank you very much, Makx. I think some of the things you have mentioned might really resonate with Pierre, who is also really working, let's say, starting from a need, I think, and bringing people together. Pierre, my question is, have you been in a situation where one of the partners in the negotiations is trying to dominate the discussions and is really pushing forward with a very particular view and trying to impose, let's say, a bit more a vision? And what are your checks and balances, let's say, to deal with that?
Maybe before answering your question, I'd like to react quickly to what Makx said. I totally agree that successful standards are driven by some need. But that being said, the assessment of the need might vary from one stakeholder to another. And while a group of people might agree together that they need something to interoperate, other stakeholders, which would be required in order to make the standard successful, may have a different assessment and don't feel the need as urgently. So I still believe some part of negotiation and not just awareness might be required in some cases. But and so as to your question, so I can't I won't be pointing fingers on giving up names, but unfortunately, yes, that kind of thing happen. And as to how we deal with that, I'm afraid I don't have a recipe for that. It's really a case per case on a case per case basis. But to react on your earlier remark, there the human factor is paramount, and I mean there's no pun intended, there's no standard way to deal with this kind of conflict, and it's really a matter of people communicating with each other, and yeah, that's part of the job, and that's not the easiest part.
Okay, great. I think this is very, this also resonates with my experience. I think personally that the personal level and what Makx has earlier called human interoperability is often underestimated compared to, let's say, the technical interoperability.
Can I say something there?
Sure, please come in.
Because one of the things that I think is also important, that it doesn't always work. If we try to build standards, and as Pierre said, there are cases where there is a conflict that you need to solve. Sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes you would end up with two conflicting standards. And then the market would actually tell you in the end which one is successful and which isn't. So I think we also have to calculate that there could be failures in standard development. Just to have sort of be realistic about it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Unless someone else wants to come in, I like to move a bit more to, let's say, implementation and also capacity and funding issues. I think maybe Gernot, you briefly mentioned that in some cases standards are not applicable to some of your members, to member states. In other cases, you might maybe have an ally that is simply not capable of implementing your standard because it requires too many resources, or they don't have any funding available. Do you have some experience with that, and how do you deal with that? Do you have maybe a comply or explain procedures, or is there an opt-out maybe?
As I said, it's basically an opt-in on the NATO side. So standard agreement is one step, then we have that, and then the decision to implement a standard is a second decision, and that's a voluntary decision by the nations. So therefore, it's really an active opt-in of the nations. But of course, you said it. We have countries of different sizes, of different economic background and financial elements of what they can do. So for that one, as a standards body, our hands would be limited. But NATO is a much bigger organization than just a standards body. So for that one, we have other mechanisms like multinational programs. So you could say if we have a common need and then 10, 12 nations want to come together, we have organizations that help those nations to then develop a common solution and then share that between those partners. So that's one mechanism to overcome some of those smaller limitations that you mentioned. So another mechanism we use is the so-called framework mechanism. So in this case, one country might act as a so-called framework nation, and then they are taking on some of the smaller ones and help them along, and potentially even provide them the capabilities or help them getting those capabilities up to the required standards that we need to be able to interoperate. So that's mechanisms that we have at play. And then the most helpful one for us, as it's interoperability, and this is another challenge we didn't talk about earlier. It's nice to have all those standards out there, but for us, what's critical is a kind of a synchronized implementation of those interoperability standards, because it always takes at least two to tango. And if we want to work together as an alliance of 30, we have to move them all forward in sync. Now, that's not possible. So therefore, backwards compatibility, designing that in our standardization approaches is something we have to be very cognizant of, because not all the ships, tanks, and aircraft of our allies will be able to be upgraded at the same point in time. That's simply not possible. So therefore, we have to have a very careful and synchronized mechanism to have nations negotiating when standards that we have agreed now will actually become into operational use. And this is where this the FMN initiatives helps us a lot, because that's where we bring the capability planners of the nations together, not the standardization people, but the capability planners that have the money, that have the programs to run, and they can then talk together when is the most opportune time to implement a standard, and then also which standards to implement when and where and what area that we have to choose, because they have to prioritize, as you mentioned, limited resources. So therefore, that's the second process. And then we have the defense planning process, where we don't really ask nations to implement a particular technical standard, because that's too detailed. So this is where kind of the capabilities are being requested. So that's all different mechanisms that we have in our toolbox of NATO, so to say, to stay together as an alliance of 30 and be able to, as Makx said, I really like that, we have to be able to work together and operate together. And that is at the operational level, the people level, not necessarily the technical, because the technical is just an enabler. It's the political will and then the ability of our forces to work together.
Okay, thank you. That's it's very clear. So you create a coalition of the willing sometimes when necessary.
Absolutely.
So maybe I wanted to ask similar question to Stephen, because I guess in your occasion as in your work, you also have a few, let's say, bottlenecks. Some partners maybe don't even have the data necessary to be able to implement your standard, and the resources and the funding. Do you have a specific view on this or an approach?
So in the area of beneficial ownership, it's true there's lots of countries that are really lacking in resources. Lots of countries in terms of their company registries or some of the operations of government that are in this area are reliant on international donors. So we are trying to work with international organizations to increase coordination, so to do various work to understand what resources people need. For example, the G7 has promised to help support 15 African beneficial ownership registers. And we're helping to make the case that they don't need, in a lot of cases, they don't need kind of fanciest technology or things. We are dealing with places that, do not have the right hardware, they don't have the computers, they don't have the training. But once they do have that, they are really keen actually to carry out this work. So it's very different in different scenarios, but some of the jurisdictions, for example, that we've been talking to this week have issues about electricity supply, let alone some of the other technology that they would be looking for. So we work with somewhere between about 30 and 40 countries all around the world, And I'd say the challenges are different in different places, even in the more developed economies. The need to collect high quality company data and especially beneficial ownership data is a new requirement, requiring new commitments either from that government or from international donors, and making sure that those developments stick and that they can be followed through on despite any political change or perhaps funding fluctuations is really key, and is a challenge that we are constantly talking to funders and to countries about.
Okay. Yes, I think this sounds familiar to many of us. We are all depending on data sources in the end. And maybe to conclude, because I want to leave some time for questions for the audience, 15 minutes we agreed, but I want to ask a final question to Pierre on very similar topic. I think my question to you is, in W3C you have quite established procedures, let's say mechanisms and voting procedures and so on. How do you, so again, I want to focus a bit on limited resources and funding of some of the partners. How do you balance the fact that you want to have procedures, but at the same time want to keep them light enough to be able to make sure that you are inclusive? So how do you ensure that your procedures are light enough to ensure inclusiveness? Yes.
So we do have a formal process, which is also ever evolving and updating and adapting to the need for change, because the way standards work and web standards work is not the same today that it was 30 years ago when W3C was created. I'm not sure the process and the concern for inclusiveness are in so much conflict. The process is, so of course the process can get in the way when it's too strict, too rigid. But I personally never felt that the W3C process was at this point that it got in the way of getting the work done and getting people and everyone included. As a matter of fact, as I said, the core values of W3C are about including everyone as a target for the process, for the standards that we build, and everyone as much as possible being involved in making the standards. So if anything, the process is here to provide some guarantees about inclusiveness rather than being a blocking thing. Then of course people have to know the process, and not everyone has read it cover to cover, and that's why every group has a team contact, a person from the team that is aware of the process, and that is somehow the guardian of the process for each group, and relieving other participants to have to know everything by heart.
Mm-hmm. If I may, Pierre-Antoine, revealing a little secret, I mentioned our FMN initiative, where we have partners and others in there, and their processes are modeled along your processes because of the inclusiveness part. So I can vouch for that. They are pretty good. They're inclusive, and they are a success model, at least for us.
Thank you.
Great. That's interesting to know. So unless someone else from the panel members want to come in on specifically on this, I propose that we open the floor for questions from the audience. And if possible, you can, in your question, refer to one of the panelists you want to address with your question.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Indeed, people have been doing that. They've been putting in questions as you've been discussing. Some of them maybe asking you to repeat a little bit because I touched on so many things. But let's start, Makx, first with you. You mentioned an interesting point, the balance between active and silent actors. How do we apply this in small initiatives like sector work groups?
Well, I think it's important that there is a moderator, let's say in a working group, in a standards group, someone who is not doesn't have the interest, commercial interest or whatever, someone who can have a let's say an impartial view. I think it is important to be aware that there is always going to be more vocal and more silent participants. Sometimes the moderator can actually help that by having sort of polls in a meeting so that people can answer. Also, the moderator needs to be aware that different participants have different interests. So being active as a moderator is important to make sure that people who want to say something can do that. Now, it's always possible, and I think in all standards activities that I've seen, there are people who are just happy to hear what happens and then take happily the result when it's there. So it's not always bad. I think it's good to have people there who are active. It's also good to have people who are just listeners, but I think the moderator needs to make sure that if people have something to say, they can.
Well, and if I, yes, sorry, if yes. I may add quickly to this, big plus one on the role of the moderator, who's someone who has to take care of this. But there are also guidelines about anyone if anyone in the group notices that someone maybe didn't get the opportunity to talk, they're also welcome to let it know and not necessarily wait for the moderator to make that move.
Yeah. So if I may, Jeff, adding to that one as well. So we basically have the same challenges, and we typically mix a written phase together with the meetings. So those people that either can't attend in a meeting or don't want to speak up in a meeting have the opportunity after the meeting to provide their inputs in a written format. So because that's absolutely clear, we want to have inclusiveness for all of those people.
Well, Gernot, let me follow up with a question for you. You mentioned a lot of the difficulties in trying to get 30 different actors all to sing from the same hymn sheet. And we have a question here from Willem van Giermert asking whether multilinguality is an additional challenge for you.
It is and it is not. So we are lucky that we only have 2 languages. When NATO was founded, they agreed on 2 languages, English and French. So therefore, our terminology office has only to deal with all our data definitions and term definitions in English and in French, not like in the EU. So our life is a little bit simpler. When it comes to data standards itself, so we had a debate, for example, on are we using different languages for, let's say, metadata tags, which would have complicated the whole thing altogether. And we agreed on only using one language for our data standards itself, but the content, of course, needs to be multilingual.
Well, thank you. Pierre-Antoine, an anonymous member of our audience, says W3C is not patent friendly. This is hampering the ability to engage with the business world. How do we accommodate standards and fair business interests?
Big disclaimer, I'm not a lawyer. And this has been part of the W3C's philosophy from the start, I believe. Indeed, there is this patent policy, which is quite constraining on members. when it comes to standards, I do believe, and that's a personal position, but I do believe that that it's important that anyone can implement them. Otherwise, well, we talked about inclusiveness, restricting standards to restricting the ability to implement standards to whomever has the possibility to pay some royalty is really the contrary of inclusiveness. That being said, standards do not cover everything there is about a given technology, and there are places for extensions, places for interpretations, and those are niches where royalty enabled patents can also flourish. So I believe it's a balance in what you standardize and what you leave open for competition and business.
Well, thank you for that. Stephen, quite a specific question for you is, do you feel like your voice has been heard in the development of EU platforms like Boris and BRIS?
So I think that Boris could go a lot further. So for people who aren't aware, that Boris is the Beneficial Ownership Registers Interconnection System. So since the 5th Anti-Money Laundering Directive in the EU, technical guidance has been put in place to say, for member states, if you want to connect beneficial ownership records by company ID, the EU ID, or their name, use these specifications, and then people can search. So there is a Boris search, so you can look for beneficial ownership records from across the EU, but then you find out that you have to pay for them all. So we would argue that if the EU has identified in its anti-money laundering reports, as I said, from October 2022, that they need to do more to connect their registers. They need to go beyond just having the same name and ID and actually look to standardize the data and connect the data from multiple registers and multiple jurisdictions, and would be really excited to carry on conversations around that. So yeah, I think that it can go further, and the implementation of the current anti-money laundering directive in the EU has led to different approaches in terms of paying for this information, in terms of the data being available openly all across the EU, and it would only benefit member states if things were more standardized, if the data was easier to exchange, even if that does have to happen in more of a private way between different governments and organizations.
Thank you. I don't want to get dragged into discussing AML all day, but I'm going to bring together two general questions, sort of quite esoteric questions, to get everyone's thoughts on them. One challenge is the number of standards. How can we decide when a standard is really needed and when we should just stay with already accepted rules? And I think linked to that, I'm going to bring in another question, which is, how do we depreciate a standard that real life has shown is not applicable or not accepted by the market? Who would like to tackle that first?
If nobody wants, I volunteer. So being a quite regulated organization, we of course have regulation for that as well. We have to review our standards all the time. So every 3 to 5 years, our standards developing bodies that are owning those standards have to really look at, have they been implemented? Are they adding values? Is there changes that have to happen? And then there's an active process of cancellation of a standard as well. The second mechanism that I showed earlier is we have the luxury of having those exercises with our forces where we can validate the actual implementation of those standards and which ones are not implemented. And that gives us at the governance level an overview where we can see there are some standards that basically nobody really implemented. So therefore, we should recommend reviewing them and cancel them. So that's at least the benefit of our organization of having more tools at hand that we can use.
Well, there's a quick question. I think, Gernot, may even be for you again. Is there a mechanism to cooperate on standards that's put in place between organisations like NATO and the EU? And I'm assuming others as well. This is a question I'm sure we've already touched on, but just to clarify.
So we have in our policy, we are of course collaborating with other standards development organizations, And our policy is to adopt open standards, industry standards from other STOs as the first choice, if they are actually suitable. So our preferred approach is to say, if we have certain requirements that are kind of specific to our world, let's say in the security world, if we could convince an STO out there to have an extension point or have a mechanism to have them in the open standard, then that would be our preferred choice to do that. But it's not NATO staff that is doing that. It's typically the NATO nations that are then also in some shape or the other involved in a standards development organization who brings those requirements into the open standards.
Well, thank you very much. We've run out of time, unfortunately, but we covered a lot of ground thanks to Jeff's expert moderation and your really, really insightful inputs. So thank you all very much, gentlemen.